Hello, and welcome to the Algebra Tutor. In this lesson, I'll be talking about adding and subtracting integers. Let's first take a look at the definition of integers, which is the set of whole numbers and their opposites. So to understand this set of numbers, let's take a look at the set of whole numbers. This set starts with 0, continues with 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now, integers are made up of this set of whole numbers and their opposites. So we're going to take this 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, and then also include their opposites. Well, 0 doesn't have an opposite, so then we go to positive 1. The opposite of a positive 1 is a negative 1. The opposite of a positive 2 is a negative 2. The opposite of a positive 3 is a negative 3, and so on. So this is a set of numbers that we'll be taking a look at as we add and subtract. Now, there's going to be several different ways we can write problems. So the first example I want to take a look at is this problem. It says 10 plus a negative 7. This also is the same as removing that plus sign and just saying 10 minus 7. But you never know what version of the problem will be presented to you. A textbook can have maybe the 10 plus a negative 7 or the 10 minus 7. Either way, what I want you to take a look at is the sign of the number. This 10 is positive. This plus sign here can also be looked at as the word and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit here. But the 7 is negative. Whether we're looking at here, 10 plus a negative 7 or 10, again, the 10's positive, but just looking at the 7, we could say it's negative. What I like to do is look at this in terms of money. If we have a number that's positive, it means we have that amount. If we're looking at a number that's negative, it's like thinking that we owe that amount. So if I go back to the original way I wrote this, I could say I have $10 and with that plus sign there, I owe 7. Or if I'm looking at this here, I don't need to write that plus sign. I have 10 and I owe 7. So if you have $10 and you owe 7, do you have enough? The answer is, of course, yes. How much do we have left over after we pay the 7? Well, we're going to have a 3. What if I wrote the problem like this? 7 minus 10. What I want you to do is take a look at each number. Ask yourself, what kind of number is the 7? What kind of number is the 10? So if we just looked at the 7, that would be positive. But if the number comes first and it's positive, there's no need to write a plus sign. But if you look at the 10 by itself, like cover up the 7, I'm going to try this here. So if we were just looking at that 10, we could say it's negative. If we're just looking at the 7, we would say it's positive. So 7 minus 10 could be looked at as we have 7, but we owe 10. So just think to yourself, if you had $7 and you owe 10 to either somebody or on a bill, you don't have enough, do you? If you pay the 7, how much would you still owe? Well, you would owe 3, but to indicate that we owe, it would just be a negative 3. Let's try a few more. Here we have negative 8 plus 12. This problem, it's a little easier to see the signs of the numbers. With that negative being first, it's clearly easy to spot that that 8 is negative, but the 12 is positive. So we could look at this as we owe 8 and we have 12. So do we have enough? We could also look at this as just rewriting it. We have 12. That 12 is positive. We owe 8. We understand this version a lot better. We would have 4. We have more than what we owe. All right, taking a look at example 4, we have a negative 7 minus a 3. So notice when I read the whole problem, I'm going to say minus. Negative 7 minus 3. Just as back in example 3, I read that as negative 8 plus 12. But when I looked at each individual number, yes, the 8 was still read as negative, but the 12 was a positive. So plus and positive go together, and minus and negative go together. It's all in how we're reading the problem. So in number 4, we have a negative 7, but we also have a negative 3. So yes, we can think of this, and it might make it a little bit easier to separate it with the plus sign. Either way, we say we owe 7 and we owe 3. So the question is, how much do we owe altogether? Well, we just add the 7 and the 3, which would be a 10, but since we owe it, it would just be a negative 10. Let's just try a few more, and then I'll give you some examples to try on your own. All right, looking at example 5, we have a negative 2 minus 7. But look at each individual number here. The 2 is a negative, and what's the 7? Well, the 7 is also a negative. So we could look at this as we owe 2 and we owe 7. So how much do we owe altogether? If you're thinking negative 9, we owe 9 altogether, you would be correct. Go ahead and read number 6 to yourself real quick. If you have to pause the video, go ahead and do that. But 6 is 3 minus 8. We have a positive 3 and a negative 8. So we have 3, we owe 8. Do we have enough? In this case, the answer would be no. So if we owed 8 on something, we were able to pay 3, we would still owe 5. Now another example I want to take a look at here. Notice how we had, I'm just going to go back a page and just point out the problem here. When we were looking at 10 plus a negative 7, we had back-to-back signs, and that plus sign really didn't change if we didn't write it. It still meant 10 minus 7. But what happens if we see two minus signs that look like that? So I just want to start by looking at this expression here. And I'm going to read this as negative negative 2, which doesn't make too much sense. It's a little difficult to understand that way. But if I looked at this as maybe minus a negative 2, so if I had 4 minus a negative 2, this minus sign stands for something. It's a little different than saying a plus sign. I can't just ignore it. I can't just remove it. So when I read 4 minus a negative 2, it sounds a little bit easier, but what exactly is it that we do? How can we simplify that a little bit better? So whenever we see a negative sign, I also want you to think of as the opposite of. Because now if I read this as the opposite of negative 2, I bet you can tell me what that is. The opposite of a negative 2 is a positive 2. So when I go to take a look at this problem, I want to rewrite it so I only see one sign. This 4 is positive. I'm going to keep that. But now this piece right here is what I was looking at over here to the left. It is the opposite of a negative 2, which becomes plus 2. And now 4 plus 2, we have 4, we have 2, or it's the opposite of owing the 2. So we have 4 and we have 2, so we have 6. Let's practice a few more like this before I have you try some on your own. Example 7, let's do 3 minus a negative 11 and maybe a negative 2 minus a negative 5. So when we look at 3 minus a negative 11, again, this 3 is positive, but the opposite of a negative 11 becomes a positive 11, and 3 plus 11, now they're both positive, will give us 14. In example 8, that 2 is negative. There's nothing that's going to change this here, so it's still a negative 2, but now the opposite of a negative 5 will become a positive 5. Now what I have here is still I owe 2 and I have 5. So do I have enough? Will my answer be positive or negative? If you were thinking positive, you're correct. I owe 2, but I have 5, so I could also think of this just rearranging the terms where the 5 is still positive and the 2 is still negative. I can write it this way, or just think of it that way. and then I have 3. I walk away with 3. So I'd like for you, go ahead and pause the video for a few minutes, and you take a look at these 5 problems and see how you're able to answer them. Okay, so if you're done now, let's go ahead and take a look. 7 minus 12. We could look at that as having 7 but owing 12. So if you thought and answered -5, you would be correct. In example 2, we have 3, or -3 rather, minus 8. So we owe 3 and we owe 8. We owe 11 altogether. Number 3, if you just remember we did this example, but just looking at this to rewrite it first, this becomes this stays as a +4, and then the opposite of a -2 becomes a +2, and we end up with 6 again. In example 4, we have a -6 plus 10. We owe 6, but we have 10. So we have 4 because we have more than enough here. And in number 5, that first -3 is going to stay negative. The opposite of a -5 is a +5. -3 plus 5 will end up with a +2. So this was a little lesson over adding and subtracting integers. If you like this, please subscribe to my website or follow me along on other videos on YouTube as well, but please subscribe so you can have as much access as possible to my videos, and feel free to contact me. Thank you.